Welcome to part three of Smarter Athletes Injury Prevention or Injury Management 101. We're looking at the idea of having a maintenance program now. Essentially, what we're trying to talk about here is using strength and conditioning work for the sake of injury production, or injury prevention, and risk reduction. And thinking about some of the strength work that you do and some of the conditioning work that you do as less about improving your speed or power or your performance um, directly and more about improving your resiliency to injury. And a lot of the time, simply put, we're referring to this type of stuff as the boring work. It's the boring work that does unfortunately need to be done in the strength and conditioning environment. And it serves a very, very valuable purpose, and that is to keep you out of harm's way when it comes to those overuse injuries, the chronic injuries, or sometimes the acute injuries that can be caused by faulty movement, poor mechanics, and those types of things. And so, a lot of what that comes back to is making sure that it's frequent, purposeful, regular, and that it's directly related to protecting those joints and that connective tissue that is so commonly related to injury in specific sport. So where we go from here is kind of examining why some athletes might be doing more maintenance work in one area of the body in particular than others. There's really no two maintenance programs that are identical when it comes to varying across sports. Obviously, pitchers in a sport like baseball are going to do a lot of maintenance work on the shoulder joint, whereas somebody like a sprinter might not do a ton of maintenance work in the same area. So we're looking at the role of strength and conditioning here as one that also plays a significant part in reducing risk of injury. And that should actually be at the top of pretty much everyone's list when we're designing our strength and conditioning goals. If you're still an athlete, you're still competitive in your sport, reducing risk of injury, preventing injury should be at the top of the list when it comes to your strength and conditioning goals. And oftentimes it's not. We look at a strength and conditioning program that's either designed by the student athlete themselves or sometimes even the trainer. And this stuff is overlooked. And we think about those exercises that look awesome. They look like the ones that are really going to make us sweat, or we really have to grind them out, and they're obviously going to result in us becoming more powerful or more forceful. And we neglect ones like these, for lack of a better term, boring exercises that are designed to protect the joints and allow them to kind of be a little bit more sustainable when it comes to the repetitive stress that we put them through. So I'm going to say it one more time. It's equally, if not more important, to make sure that your strength and conditioning programming involves this type of work. So let's kind of take a look here at some of the common causes of injury that happen and how we might be able to mitigate the risk of getting those types of injury by integrating some of the appropriate strength and conditioning work. So here are these kind of four main causes that we've isolated here, and we'll go through them one by one. The first one is muscular imbalance. And we talk about a muscular imbalance. This could mean it's either unilateral, meaning one side is a lot stronger than the right. One side, the left could be a lot stronger than the right. One side a lot stronger than the other. And as a result, we're kind of predisposing that weak side to injury. It's just not strong enough to sustain the same amount of repetitive stress or force as its stronger counterpart. And that's a unilateral muscular imbalance. So once again, an example of that would be the left quadriceps group being a lot stronger than the right quadriceps group. In the case of maybe a soccer player, somebody who does a lot of running or extension of the knee, at high speed, and as a result, over time and repetitive stress, it's going to cause that weaker side to succumb to injury. There's also another type of muscular imbalance that we should address. It's called a synergistic muscular imbalance. And when we talk about a synergistic imbalance, that's when we're talking about muscles that need to work together to perform a certain muscle action. So when we do a lot of different muscle actions, especially sport-specific ones, it's not just one muscle doing the work for us. It's a group of muscles working together. But in a lot of cases, one of those muscles in the group doesn't necessarily have the strength or the stamina to keep up with the rest of the muscles in the group. It is essentially the weakest link in that kinetic chain of muscle action. And when we look at a synergistic muscular imbalance, the weakest link in the chain is the one that's going to break first, and it's the one that's going to be harmed first. And a great example of that would be something like a tennis elbow. And we look at tennis players who have this this significant amount of strength and power as they rotate through the shoulder, and they put all this repetitive stress on the shoulder joint, and the shoulder actually feels fine, but a lot more distally down, closer to the elbow, the injury is caused by repetitive stress, and it's an inflammation of the tendons that are distal to the upper arm, and those stresses are, directly a result of overuse, and the weak link in that muscle action of repetitive high speed hitting of the ball in a sport like tennis. Even though the shoulder joint is the one that's bearing most of the load, it's that synergistic muscular imbalance that's caused something like a tennis elbow to kind of occur, and the tendonitis to kind of flare up. Let's move to cause number 2, which is a functional movement limitation. And simply put, this is when we lack mobility or stability that's really required to do a task well. What this ultimately results in is a repetitive strain that doesn't necessarily have the support that it needs to have. We look at maybe a distance runner who takes these great big strides while they're sprinting, but they have extremely tight hamstrings and extremely tight hip flexors. So not only are they limiting the range of motion that they have in the gait cycle, but they're also putting an extreme amount of stretch and stress on the joints that can't necessarily handle it. And over time, something's got to give. And I mean, we could go with a million more examples of a functional movement limitation, but essentially we're talking about anything that is related to a limited amount of mobility, flexibility, or stability in an athlete, putting them at a higher risk of injury. Number 3, muscular strength deficit. This is essentially as simple as it sounds. If we don't have the strength to repeat the task or to perform the task at the speed and power requirement that we need to, we're putting ourselves at risk for sure. If we talk about on the endurance side of this, we could look at a distance runner again, somebody like a cross-country runner or a marathon runner who is going to go out there and kind of run 10 miles or maybe even further, and their feet and their lower limbs are going to be pounding the pavement or pounding the ground for any extreme length of time, but they don't necessarily have the muscular strength or the muscular endurance in the lower limbs yet to kind of tolerate that volume of stress. As a result, we see things like stress fractures in the lower limb or in the foot, because the muscles and the soft tissue and the connective tissue that are there to support the joints involved are too fatigued to actually do that job, and the amount of shock being absorbed by the actual bones is far too great, and fracture is the result. Right? When the strength deficit is happening, it's not necessarily an endurance deficit, but it's a strength deficit. We could again look at like a higher speed movement, or a sport like football or rugby that involves not necessarily high speed, but really high strength or high force production and movement. And we can think of a whirlwind of injuries that are going to result from not being strong enough to handle the stress that's being put against your body by brute force. And the last one we'll talk about is biomechanical inefficiency. Now, this is a little bit more complex than it actually is. When we talk about a biomechanical inefficiency, we're talking about a movement pattern or a technique that hasn't necessarily been mastered. And as a result, we're doing it poorly. And while we do that thing that should be kind of mastered as a technique poorly, thousands and thousands of times, we're probably putting our bodies at some level of risk when it comes to the repetitive stress and how that might affect things like a tendonitis or an inflammation in a joint. Again, we could go back to the example of tennis elbow. We could also look at somebody who is a figure skater, for example, and has poor landing technique, poor jumping technique, and the amount of long-term stress this might put on joints like the knees and hips. So there's probably, again, a million other examples we could use for biomechanical inefficiency, but in a nutshell, what we're saying here is we need to master the technique of doing something well before progressing to doing it at a high speed or high volume. So let's kind of look a little bit more closely at muscular imbalance. When we talk about that synergistic group, we really want to say it's simply because one or more group of muscle is no longer doing its job, and that's probably the best way to explain how we could basically succumb to a synergistic muscular imbalance. It's an extremely common cause of chronic injury. So again, using the examples that we talked about earlier is probably best. An imbalanced development in the soft tissue is crucial, right, to supporting a joint that will ultimately result in fatigue in some local area of the body. So essentially, we're talking about, again, that weakest link in the chain analogy. So whether it's a difference between strength or endurance between the two groups of muscle, it has to be a substantial difference. And what we're dealing with here is an added risk of placing a joint at risk of injury. And again, this could be a chronic injury just caused by the repetitive stress, but it could also be an acute injury caused by the fact that one group of muscle or one part of a group of muscle was no longer able to do its job, putting an athlete in a vulnerable position to be on the receiving end of a tackle or some type of impact, and now we have an acute injury. So all the same, any kind of muscular imbalance puts us at a higher risk of injury. Sorry. And here's a pretty good example. So if we have a pitcher who's developed an imbalance between the flexors and the extensors of the throwing arm, we look at, in this case, the biceps, that muscle group, that's responsible for decelerating the movement that follows the release of the ball. So the biceps basically is like putting on the brakes, right? And if they're not strong enough, and we don't do a good enough job at putting the brakes on when we throw the ball, we put an increase in the amount of stress that ends up on the shoulder joint. So in that follow-through phase of the throw, all of the tendons that are supposed to support that shoulder joint can basically equate to a chronic injury. All right. If we're talking about a unilateral imbalance, again, remember that's one side that's stronger than the other. We're essentially talking about somebody having a dominant side. And this is actually really common. And in fact, most people watching this right now will understand they have a dominant side in the lower body, in the upper body, maybe in both cases. And almost every single athlete will demonstrate a unilateral imbalance to some degree, but it's the size of that imbalance, the size of the gap that exists that kind of determines how high or low of a risk we are, in categorically when it comes to potential for injury. So if we look at athletes, and again, I've been doing this for 10 years, and I can say, I promise you that when we look at athletes who strength train more regularly, that gap is smaller. The gap between the strong side and the weak side is a lot smaller in athletes who strength train regularly. It is sometimes enormous in athletes that don't do any strength training at all. So again, let's go to an example here of a unilateral imbalance. Let's talk about maybe a hockey player who's repetitively performing a drill that involves, sprinting out of a stop position and is constantly relying on those first big 3 pushes with the legs, and they're always going right, left, right. Those 3 big, powerful contractions, extending the hips, pushing off the right side one time, the left side one time, and then again off the right side one time, firing the glutes and extending the hips. Over time, that hip extension and knee extension on that right side is going to become far more powerful. And it's going to become far more powerful because the right side's getting the opportunity to do twice as much work. So as a result, we're going to see injuries that are related to limited mobility on the left side. We're going to see injuries that are related to limited strength on the left side. All right, so the solution in those cases is, of course, specific strength work. All right, anytime we're looking at a muscular imbalance, whether it's unilateral or synergistic, the answer is the same. We have to look at exercises that are balanced and holistic. They don't focus too heavily on one muscle action only. So we want to make sure we have an equal amount of, say, push and pull exercises. That would be a really good example. We also want to make sure that when it's a unilateral muscular imbalance, we're doing single side strength work. So instead of thinking about how much you can push on that leg press machine, thinking about working the left side and the right side individually and making sure that single leg decline leg press or something like equivalent to that is, you're closer to equal in terms of force production on either side. All right, so let's move to number 2, functional movement limitations. When it comes to mobility and stability, we want to look at our functional movement limitations. Athletes who demonstrate these limitations, generally, they can expect to find themselves injured far more often than their counterparts. And since mobility and stability are paramount to joint health, we want to make sure that we're building strength in the muscle groups that support a joint before we start to address the limitations. So we don't want to build strength on top of dysfunction. We want to make sure that we're looking at that limitation first, whether it involves mobility, stability, or both, and we can basically start to conquer those limitations in an unloaded scenario. So somebody who doesn't have a nice, good, deep squat probably shouldn't be loading up their barbell with 150 or 200 pounds and performing squats regularly. They should be working on body weight squats and squats with kettlebells in the goblet position or the medicine ball held in the overhead position, forcing themselves to improve on their mobility and their stability before they start building strength on top of dysfunction. All right? Imagine a basketball player who suffered, 2 non-consecutive ankle sprains during the season. And in both cases, this player is kind of rushed back to training and competition after they've kind of gone through the first 1 week of recovery, and their ankle feels better and they can stand on it and they can hop up and down in one place on it, so they feel like they're better to go. And since the ankle feels better, the athletes completely neglected to continue working on any mobility or stability drills, and that really doesn't bring that ankle to a fully rehabilitated state. And as a result, we still have a functional movement limitation. The ankle still lacks the stability or the proprioception and probably a lot of the mobility that should be required to play basketball at a high performance level. So of course, the likelihood of re-injury is extremely high. It's not bad luck if an athlete sprains their ankle the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time all in the same season. That's not bad luck. That is neglect. That's straight up neglect. So we need a better approach to rehabilitation. Just because the ankle feels better and we can start walking around without limping and hopping up and down in one place, that doesn't mean we're anywhere near fully recovered. We've got to address that limitation. So assessment of the ankle continuously and application of the corrective exercises is the solution here. And this is the solution for any functional movement limitation. Assessment of the joints involved and application of the corrective exercises, whatever they might be. So of course, corrective exercises are different if it involves the ankle than it would if it involved the knee or if it would involve the shoulder or the hip. But we have to know what those exercises are, and we'll talk a little bit about how we can find that out later on in this presentation. But for an athlete that really wants to fully rehabilitate that injured joint, they need to be keeping track of their progress, and they need to make sure that they're aligning the respective corrective exercises with the injury that they have. All right, so these exercises should be a cornerstone in any program design, and they should be incorporated into things like warm-ups and any non-fatiguing exercise or drills that an athlete's supposed to do, or what we call accessory strength work that's in a strength training program. These are all great opportunities to take exercises that involve injury or an injury history that a player has and put them right into the programming on a regular basis, even when the athlete isn't injured. Let's move to number 3. The muscular strength deficit. Whether it's endurance or strength, the muscular strength deficit is meaning that the muscle is not strong enough to perform the volume or the intensity of the work that you're asking for. As a result, it's going to end up damaged. So it's true that we do damage muscle through the repetitive stress that we put on it while we're training or competing. And we do that so we can basically provide a stimulus for a positive adaptation so that we can come back a little stronger when the muscle does recover, when it repairs itself, after we drink our protein shakes and recover for a day or two. That's true. But a group of muscles nowhere close to being conditioned to sustain the repetitive stress or acute stress of a task if it's not strong enough to begin with and we just start, jumping up and down on hardwood floors for 10 hours a week. So we can't really just assume that that's going to condition our muscle on its own. A lot of the time we see players who have an off season and then a season of a sport starts up again and they deal with an injury right away because there was no muscular strength or strength work happening in the off season. Here's a good endurance example. Imagine a runner who's never attempted to complete a long distance race beyond 5K, but they try to run the half marathon, and the half marathon is a 21-kilometer race. The repetitive stress of running on a paved surface or a hard surface is going to inevitably place a new level or a higher demand for shock absorption on the muscle groups that support the knee and the hip and the ankle, right? So we've got this runner who's never really run further than 5K before, and now they want to run 4 times that distance. And the injuries that are gonna result are usually generically called things like shin splints. If you're really unlucky, you're gonna end up with a stress fracture of the lower leg or foot, and some of the connective tissue involved in the hip, knee, or ankle that could also all be injured. All of it for the same reason. There was a muscular strength deficit there. The muscles that are supposed to engage to absorb that shock and support the running gait over long distances were just not strong enough on the endurance side. They didn't have the stamina to keep going. Another example, though, if we look at the strength side, let's imagine somebody who's just a fitness enthusiast. They just like working out, but they want to achieve a new personal best on the bench press, and today's going to be the day they do it. And I mean, this is common sense, but I'm going to give you the example anyway. Despite knowing that the current personal best for one single repetition is 190 pounds, he or she decides to load up the barbell with 240 pounds, so 50 pounds beyond their previous personal best. So not only do they have a very low likelihood of success here, they have a very high likelihood of sustaining injury. And while lowering the bar to the chest, the strain on the muscles that are supposed to support the shoulder joint is way too great. right? And it's during that eccentric lowering phase that all the accessory muscles that are responsible for kind of helping out with shoulder stability, those are the ones that are going to become injured. And now, even worse, this athlete needs to take 4 weeks off from doing any upper body strength work, and they lose even more strength as a result of having to detrain over the course of those 4 weeks. And I put this example on here for obvious reasons, because there's not a year that goes by in my role where I don't hear about this happening by somebody who is being minimally supervised and trying to do something that is outlandishly outside of their comfort zone, let alone ability. And as much as it would be a great achievement to go from a 190-pound maximum bench press right up to a 240-pound one, the likelihood of that happening is fairly low, and the risk of sustaining injury is fairly high. So again, our solution here, it's what we call progressive overload. And this is, again, fairly common sense. But in the role of strength and conditioning, when it comes to addressing muscular strength as a deficit, we want to make sure that we have a maintenance program. So we're talking about those rotators of the shoulder, making sure they're strong enough to stabilize that shoulder when it's under that high load. But in particular, we also need to rely on something called progressive overload. And this is a gradual approach to increasing load over time. And we're looking at numbers like 5%. And if we succeed, yeah, maybe we try another 5%, but certainly not a 50-pound increase on the bench press over our previous personal best without really trying anything in between. All right, so guidelines with respect to progressive overload, very simple. They do vary a little bit based on the type of training, but when we're looking at something like a bench press or a bigger lift, we're using those numbers closer to 5%. And the other thing we like to do is use something called a repetition range. So when we look at designing our programs, instead of saying I'm going to do 3 or 4 sets of 10 reps exactly, we're giving ourselves a repetition range, saying 6 minimum, 10 maximum, meaning if I can't get to the 6 repetition number, the weight's too heavy. But if I can get to the 10 repetition, it's light enough for me to advance the load, right? That's the green light to move forward. And again, very common sense, but we want to make sure that our athletes are practicing safe progressive overloading technique as they're approaching things like personal bests. So let's look at the very last one here when it comes to common cause of sport injury. That's biomechanical inefficiency. So when we're talking about a repetitive stress or a high-speed movement that's happening on joints that just aren't moving the way they are supposed to when it comes to the technical training side. And biomechanical inefficiency and the risk it carries does vary across sports. And here's just kind of a graphic I created to give you an example of how that's true. In some sports, there's very little skilled movement required in order to be fairly high performance in that sport. But the other variable we need to look at is the risk of injury that could be caused by poor form. All right. And if I take something like long distance running, I want to say there's a fairly decent risk of injury that could be caused by poor form, not because the movement skill required is high, but because the repetitive stress is very, very high. So if you get what I'm saying here, I'm talking about the fact that there's not a lot to the technique of learning how to run well. There's a little bit of technique involved, right? But because the volume is so high, not having that little bit of technique still puts you at the higher risk of injury that could be caused by poor form, right? If I look at something like a football linebacker, there might not necessarily be a lot of coaching involved in the skill for the few particular jobs of that person. And as a result, there's probably not a lot of risk of injury caused by poor form. I'm not saying there's not a lot of risk of injury caused in that role, because there definitely is. But more often than not, the risk of injury caused in that particular role in sport is not necessarily due to poor form so much as it is due to impact and collision. If we look at something like freestyle swimming, if you are a swimmer or you were a swimmer at any point in your life, you probably know that there's a ton of technique coaching involved in that stroke. And when we talk about the swim stroke, if it's done poorly, it's your ticket to injury for sure. There's a lot of technique coaching in freestyle swimming. The risk of injury caused by poor form is fairly high as well, because the repetitive stress on the shoulder under the water time and time again. So I put the risk of injury caused by poor form at the same level as distance running, but the movement skill required to learn how to do it well probably takes a lot more time than something like distance running. In the very top right corner, I put something like Olympic weightlifting. And if you've ever watched an Olympic weightlifting competition, you can probably understand why it's up there. There is a ton of practice and skill development required to master the technique in Olympic weightlifting, and the risk of injury that could be caused by poor form is something that you probably don't even want to think about. So if we look at a sport like that, there's very few injuries that actually occur in a sport like Olympic weightlifting. But that's because people who do get into the sport and reach the level of competition, they basically have mastered technique. And it's a perfect example of why we can't necessarily have people just coming into a weight training environment and thinking that today's the day I'm going to start Olympic lifting, and by the end of this workout I'm going to be trying to get 150 pounds up over my head. That's not really the approach we ever want to take. Anyway, there's probably a lot more examples that could kind of fall onto that graph or chart somewhere. We could plot them all somewhere on there. I just kind of wanted to put a few to kind of illustrate the way those two variables are related. And when we're clarifying what biomechanical inefficiency really means, it's not an attack on athleticism or even a suggestion that some athletes and positions are more athletic than others. It's really just me suggesting that there are different levels of risk associated with different athletes and their positions. I'm not going to sit here and say that because I put the football linebacker in the very bottom left corner, that's not an athletic position or an athletic person. In fact, that's probably a fine example of some of the most athletic bodies that are out there. But when we talk about the skilled movement and its relationship to the risk of injury, it's not high, right? So what's really important to discover here is that the important thing we really want to recognize rather is the level of influence that biomechanics has on the skilled movement is a part of your injury risk. And it's one part of your injury risk. It's not all of your injury risk, right? Again, there's four big variables in this list. And identifying whether or not there are some skilled movements that you need to master, that should be a priority for every athlete. All right, so somebody who's going into, if you're not on this chart by your sport, maybe figuring out where you are and saying, well, yeah, what are those skilled movements that I need to make sure I'm doing perfectly well so I can remove biomechanical inefficiency off my list of risk for potential injury. Again, we'll do one more example here, and I did talk about tennis already, but if we imagine that tennis player who does demonstrate improper arm mechanics during a serve, without any correction from their coach, this player is going to be working tirelessly on trying to get that serve speed up, and see how much velocity they can produce and how hard they can hit that ball. And this is probably going to result in a subsequent arm and back injury, all right, because it's not something we can do high speed, repetitive stress without good mechanics. And through a biomechanical assessment, if a coach or an athletic therapist or a strength coach and those people kind of work together as a team to determine that it's actually been poor technique that's caused this injury, well, then we can look at things that might also be to blame for that poor technique, because maybe it's not just the learning how to move properly on its own that's causing it. Maybe there's something there like a synergistic muscle imbalance that's worsening the problem as well, or one side just not being strong enough to complete the task, right? So while biomechanical inefficiency is kind of a blanket category here, there might be other things that feed into it. And again, we look at a solution for this, and we want to talk about something like rehabilitative strength work. And we look at these programs that are rehabilitative in nature, and we say they got to be progressive. They got to start at level 1, and they got to move to level 2, level 3, level 4, and then we can clear that athlete for a return when they're showing that their strength is up higher than it was before the injury. Their movement patterns are showing a lot more efficiency, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of technical or flaws in the movement. This can be really tricky, and it's often not done well unless there's a small team of people working together on it. So there might be a strength and conditioning coach working on the rehabilitative strength side. There's definitely going to be a sport-specific coach working on the skilled movement side, and they're going to be working together to kind of decipher whether or not these movements have been corrected and whether or not there's things that still need to be done with respect to rehabilitative strength to kind of feed them along and help kind of fuel that fire. So sports medicine professionals also going to be working in a team like this to kind of make sure that strength and conditioning people are being able to kind of provide monitored and progressive return or rehabilitation. So again, that's going to be something like myself working with an athletic therapist, and the athletic therapist saying, well, I'm seeing this area is still kind of fairly injured and fairly weak, so can we continue to kind of isolate these few movements to really speed this process up and get this one area of the muscle action up to where it should be with respect to the amount of strength it can produce and the amount of mobility that it's capable of. And that's the end of part 3. I know it's a lot to digest, but when we're looking at causes of injury, there's really no way to just say get stronger and prevent injury. I like to kind of take strength work and break it down into those 4 categories when it comes to talking about preventing injury. And I hope that does help. In part 4, we'll actually look at some of the practical applications of what a rehabilitation part looks like. And I hope you'll join me for that soon. As always, if there's any questions or concerns, you can reach out to me by email. My email address is up on the screen, and the website is also always an option, strongerbcss.ca. Thanks for watching.